Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video. On August 1, 1940, Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke officially delivered a decree that codified the unofficial policy and sentiments of the Japanese government and military. This marked the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a strategic initiative aimed at creating a bloc of East Asian nations led by Japan and free from the influence of and domination by Western colonial powers. With the use of an aggressive ideological framework, Asia would unite in the Japanese spirit and via Japanese stewardship. Advocating for Pan-Asian unity under Japanese dominion, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere signified Japan's ambitions to expand its influence over territories not only under its control, such as Manchuria, Taiwan, Korea, and the Marshall Islands, but also those in Southeast Asia under Western colonial rule. The proposed security and economic federation included new territories already occupied by European foreign powers such as British Malay, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, and British Burma. It was abundantly clear to Western powers that the goal of Japanese foreign policy and later security policy was to galvanize the economic potential of these regions for Japanese industry. Japanese industry was too dependent on critical resources provided by Western powers via trade, chiefly iron, tin, rubber, and most importantly, petroleum. So Japan's aggressive expansion was partly fueled by the need for these natural resources, the supply of which was severely impacted by trade embargoes put in place by the Roosevelt administration in an attempt to restrain Japan's territorial ambitions. The formal declaration of policy under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was just a diplomatic formality for Japanese economic interests in Southeast Asia. This later transformed into a brutal military and naval campaign in Southeast Asia under the guise of expanding Pan-Asian ideology, influence, and resources. While using Taiwan as an important jumping-off point for military personnel, intelligence operations, and intercultural exchanges, Imperial Japanese forces conducted lightning-fast amphibious assaults and well-coordinated ground attacks in what is known as the Southern Expansion Campaign. Although Japan's expansion throughout Southeast Asia was initially successful, as the war in China ground on and the full weight of U.S. industrial production brought increasing pressure on sea, land, and air, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere began to crumble under the assaults by the Western Allied powers Japan had sought to replace. The following timeline provides a brief overview of this rapid campaign of expansion, which was then followed by years of grinding war. 1931 to 1932, Japan invades Manchuria, marking the beginning of an aggressive territorial expansion in Asia. July 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War begins, with Japan launching a full-scale invasion of China. August 1940, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is announced. September 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, aligning itself with the Axis powers. September 22, 1940, Japanese troops occupy northern French Indochina, present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, after the Vichy French government grants them access. July 1941, Japan occupies southern French Indochina, further expanding its control in Southeast Asia. December 7th and 8th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines, marking a significant escalation of the Pacific War. December 1941 through January 1942, Japanese forces rapidly advance into British Malaya and capture the key British fortress of Singapore in February 1942. January 1942, Japan invades Burma, present-day Myanmar, aiming to cut off Allied supply lines to China and secure a buffer zone against possible British counterattacks from India. February to March 1942. Japan conquers the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, securing vital oil resources. March 1942. Japanese forces occupy the Solomon Islands and the northern coast of New Guinea, extending their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. May 1942. Japan suffers a strategic defeat at the Battle of Coral Sea, the first major naval engagement in which aircraft carriers played a decisive role. June 1942. The turning point in the Pacific War comes with Japan's defeat at the Battle of Midway, where the U.S. Navy decisively defeated the Japanese fleet, significantly weakening Japan's naval and air power. 1942 through 1944. Japan continues to expand in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but faces increasing resistance and counterattacks by Allied forces. 1944 through 1945. The Allied island-hopping campaign bypasses many Japanese strongholds in the Pacific, recapturing territory and moving closer to Japan. August 1945. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, Japan surrenders, ending World War II in Asia and the Pacific. Once perceived as Asian liberators and a model of societal, industrial, and military modernization, through the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan simply replaced the extractive policies used by Western colonial predecessors with its own in the territories they conquered. The colonial yoke remained in place. In some cases, nationalist movements and anti-colonial sentiments made certain Asian populations initially receptive to Japanese occupation as an Asian contemporary that would respect and protect their fellow Asian people's culture, religion, and society from Western colonialism. In Vietnam and the Philippines especially, there was an underlying perception of the Japanese invasion as an opportunity for liberation, which likely contributed to national post-colonial consciousness. Over time, Imperial Japan's true intentions became apparent and fixated on the extractive industries and practices needed to support their war efforts. The result was the appropriation of land, massive destruction of property, and the significant loss of human life, which contributed to further colonial subjectivity. In 1941, when Japanese troops aligned themselves with the Vichy French government in Indochina, much of the old colonial systems remained intact, and Vietnam later experienced one of the worst famines in its history as Japanese troops burned much-needed rice as fuel rather than using it to feed a starving populace. In Indochina, Malaysia, Thailand, and Burma, as many as 300,000 Romusha laborers perished during the construction of the Burma-Siam Railroad, dying from disease and literally being worked to death. Japanese, Taiwanese, and Korean women, looking for work and often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, were coerced, lied to, or forcibly detained to serve as comfort women for soldiers and laborers throughout the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. As these atrocities unfolded during the late 1930s and during World War II, national movements across the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere began questioning official Japanese rhetoric, which in turn contributed to their respective steps towards independence from under any colonial yoke and inspired those under Japanese control with a new national consciousness. With Japan's surrender, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, much like Germany's Thousand-Year Reich, collapsed and was consigned to the dustbin of history, while a vastly different world order came into being.